from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
As we continue our study in the book of Acts, arriving at chapter 25, we've been a while now in this adventure that started out with Paul going to the temple, trying to do something to help the Jews understand that he is not against them, but rather he is for them in sharing the message of the long-awaited Messiah. But the Jews from Asia that continued to plague him, who were bound up in hate and vice, really, pursued him and created a riot in the temple, caused him to be drug out into the street and be beaten, and only the intervention of the Roman commander saved Paul's life. But as he was carried up the steps to the barracks, Paul tried to address the crowd and share with them Jesus. That didn't work. The folks, when it got to the resurrection, they began to throw a fit and tear their clothes and throw dirt in the air. And so the Roman commander brings him inside, and Lysias decides to have him present his case before the Sanhedrin. And that doesn't last very long at all. Again, Paul mentions the resurrection, and then the Sanhedrin counsel themselves in a very unspiritual or very immature way, gets into a big ruckus and a big riot. And so the commander has to pull him out. And so since they can't deal with hearing his message, they plan an assassination attempt, but by the Lord's providence, that is found out, and Lysias transfers him to Caesarea, and there he will be before the governor Felix. He will give his story, his testimony. He will witness Jesus to Felix, who will listen, and at the end of chapter 24, he's pricked, it would seem. There's some conviction, but yet not enough, and so he puts Paul off, and sadly, he allows Paul to remain imprisoned for 2 years without pursuing it, without letting anything happen. So anything progress in terms of the legal standpoint. I can't imagine, if it were my case, how frustrated I would be and irritated that Paul has done nothing but what is right. And his accusers, going all the way back to the Jews in Asia that were following him around, creating such problems, how these people could claim to be religious and godly and spiritual, and yet they are given to lies and violence, and even the premeditated murder, assassination attempt, and that the Sanhedrin, the high priest, would sanction this, would be okay with this. Paul has been dealt these setbacks at every step. But going all the way back to chapter 23, verse 11, God had told him in that vision that as you have testified before me in Jerusalem, so you shall in Rome. So Paul has this promise and assurance that his journey is at least going to Rome. So Paul has had 2 years. People have been able to come and go and minister to his needs and so on. But he's had 2 years to contemplate all of this. And so rather than being embittered, rather than being frustrated, rather than being cynical, Paul has continued his close relationship with the Lord and his dependence on God in terms of the schedule, so that when the opportunity arises, Paul is willing to speak in those opportunities. So 2 years have passed, and now there is a new governor that has come to be, back in verse 27 of chapter 24. But after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul imprisoned. So Felix puts it off, which is not right. This whole thing launched when Lysias, the Roman commander, understood that Paul was a Roman and that he'd put him in chains, and you can't do that. And so the Roman citizen has the right to due process, which Paul has been denied. Because after the accusations were made before Felix, Felix should have made a decision. There should have been a verdict of not guilty, and Paul should have been released. Instead, he's simply left, ignored and neglected for 2 years. Finally, Felix is replaced by Festus in chapter 25, verse 1. Festus is going to begin to move things along. Now, some things have changed. Ananias is no longer the high priest. Following him, he was followed by Jonathan. And as we mentioned, Felix was not a man of godly character, but evil and dark indeed. And he used the Jewish assassination groups to wield his power throughout the area, including having Jonathan, the high priest, killed by such assassination. So now by the time we get to chapter 25, verse 1, we have a third high priest named Ishmael, who now rules the Sanhedrin. So Ananias was the one involved in this, going back to the original riot in the temple. But in the intervening 2 years that have passed, Jonathan's come and been taken, and now we have Ishmael. So a whole different high priest, plenty of opportunity for change, and a new governor. Verse 1, the new governor, Festus, then having arrived in the province 3 days later, went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. So he would have arrived by ship from Rome in Caesarea. And then the first thing he does is travel uphill. And again, the way that Luke writes is accurate, and as one who is an eyewitness, for it is uphill from Caesarea to Jerusalem. You gain an elevation in that journey. So the first thing he will do is go to the Jewish capital over the region with which he reigns, to get the lay of the land, to understand how things are going. He's doing a responsible thing as a leader, for the first thing he does, without much delay, is head on over to Jerusalem. He chooses not to ignore the Jews, but rather to try to connect with them, perhaps to understand them. Verse 2, and the chief priests, so now we're talking about Ishmael and others, and the chief priests and the leading men of the Jews brought charges against Paul, and they were urging him, requesting a concession against Paul. Now this is fascinating. The hate is so deep. They are so blinded by their hate that this is passed on from Ananias to Jonathan to now Ishmael, and they still, the first opportunity they have, they lunge at the possibility of harming Paul. And what was a foiled plot more than 2 years earlier in terms of this assassination boils right to the surface again. Now, last time the assassination group, or the 40 men, they weren't assassins by trade, it wouldn't seem, the 40 men who had dedicated and pledged themselves to this assassination brought this to the chief priest, and they approved. The Sanhedrin approved. This time, the idea is originating from the chief priests and the Sanhedrin themselves. So even after 2 years where Paul has been in house arrest, he's not been out and about, they're still so angry, there's still so much hate for just this one man that they immediately pursue the possibility of hurting Paul the first chance they get. In fact, they're urging this new governor, so they're pressuring him as a group with all of their status and all their clout. So if Festus is coming and trying to make a good first impression and trying to get along, they're going to latch onto this and try to make the most of his immediate goodwill. Probably as well, it would take advantage of the fact that Festus is brand new. There's no indication that he knows the lay of the land in terms of Jewish theology, or that he's familiar with how all of this works with the chief priests and the Sanhedrin and all their laws. In fact, what we'll see in a moment later in the chapter, he doesn't seem to have any real grasp at all of the theological issues that are at hand, or the matters of the law of Moses. He has no familiarity with that, and not really a whole lot of interest, as you'd expect from a Roman. So in verse 3, they're requesting a concession against Paul, a favor against Paul, because as Luke writes this, what they're asking is not in the pursuit of justice or righteousness or truth. It is against Paul. What is this favor? What is this concession? Well, that he might have him brought to Jerusalem. Why? Luke tells us at the same time, setting an ambush to kill him on the way. So they're back to the same plot that was foiled when Lysias, the Roman commander, got word of it and sent an heavily armed escort with Paul in the dead of night and escaped this plot. So we're right back to where we started. Let's bring him up to Jerusalem on the way, because since Festus is not alarmed in any way, he's not been tipped off, he's not aware of all this, surely he would probably escort Paul with a real simple transportation escort, not the multiple centurions and forces and chariots and soldiers and so on that took Paul from Jerusalem to Caesarea. It'd probably be a very small group. These religious men, these leaders of the Jews, these supposed spiritual lights for God's people, are so deep in their hatred and darkness that they're going to slaughter, or they desire to, not only murder an innocent Paul, but also kill any men around him if that's what's necessary. And then the whole thing could be blamed on the roving bands of Jewish assassins. The problem is, as this is being written, we're only but about 3 decades or so from the Jewish nation being plunged into ruin and despair in the wars that are coming. They're finally going to go to war against Rome, and Caesar will send his army, and Jerusalem in AD 70 is going to be crushed. The temple is going to be destroyed, and there will be a terrible slaughter of the Jewish people, as Jesus foretold in Matthew chapter 24. But this kind of very behavior, this recklessness, this vice, this darkness is what is bringing the hand of judgment against them. So they're going to kill Paul, and they're going to kill anybody traveling with him. That's just fine. That's not a problem. Verse 4, Festus then answered that Paul was being kept in custody at Caesarea, and that he himself was about to leave shortly. Therefore, he said, let the influential men among you go there with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them prosecute him. Now, so far, what Festus is doing is following proper Roman law and protocol. Since Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea as a Roman citizen in a Roman province, the Jews, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, has no bearing whatsoever on any matter of Roman law. And so this request is absolutely ludicrous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Festus doesn't get upset with him. It's not like, because he's there on a goodwill mission and we're all going to get along, we're all going to be friends. So he doesn't scold him or chastise him, but just pretty plainly goes, no. But what he offers is, why don't you come with me? And if not providing transportation, he is a minimum providing protection that they can travel with his envoy, travel with his vanguard back to Caesarea, which is honoring them, it is supporting them. And so he's trying to give them what he thinks they want, and that is an opportunity for a trial. But of course that defeats again the ambush plan. So in verse 6, after he had spent not more than 8 or 10 days among them, he went down to Caesarea, went up to Jerusalem, down to Caesarea, finished out his time there, and this very early. He hadn't even been in Caesarea but just a day before he comes to Jerusalem. So he's seen the sights and shook the hands and, kissed the babies and made the rounds and made the introductions, and now it's time to go back to Caesarea, which is where he lives and is from the place that he rules. So he goes back to Caesarea. And on the next day, so without delay, without stringing this out, on the next day he took a seat on the tribunal, so on that raised dais or raised platform, and he ordered Paul to be brought. Now, there's no indication in the text that Festus has talked to Paul. It would be a very short conversation, for he leaves for Jerusalem very soon after arriving in Jerusalem. He leaves for Jerusalem very soon after arriving in Caesarea. Perhaps at the most, Festus, as he's checking into the new palace, and there's a clerk there somewhere, no doubt, that's filling him in on all the goings and comings and what's going on, and probably was a list of things pending, and one might have been a brief mention of this particular case. It's likely Festus would have taken this as some kind of odd situation where there's some political prisoner named Paul, and he's there, and he'll get to that eventually. It's just not a big deal. So it probably startled him, or at least surprised him. It made him curious that the very Jewish leaders he's gone to be introduced to and make connections with, that's the first thing they want. And they want it pretty bad. They actually ask him for a favor in doing so. So he pretty swiftly brings this to fruition. So in verse 7, after Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. So in the Roman court, you have the judge who is seated on a raised platform, and then everyone else in the courtroom is standing. They're not divided by sides. They don't have a center aisle. You don't have the defendant at his table on one side, the prosecutor at his table on another side. They're all going to be all there in the same space. So it's not unusual for them to all to be together, but obviously they're going to surround Paul and they're going to make lots of accusations. And so they don't have a case. Now this time they didn't bother with a Roman lawyer. That didn't go well with Felix, so they decided not to go that route this time. Tertullus, the Roman lawyer, made the best case that he could, but there's no case. So what these men do is a classic example is when you have a weak point, you just get loud, right? If you know you're wrong, you get mean. Have you ever been in an argument and then you've realized in the middle of the argument that, oh, that you were mistaken. But have you ever continued the argument past the point of ignorance? In other words, you realize, oh, but sometimes we do. Either we're already worked up and mad, so now we're just mad, or we don't want to let the other person win, or we don't want to admit defeat, or we're too prideful. There's many terrible reasons why we might continue an argument. And what you'll notice is that's when the argument shifts to what is about the issue, and it becomes personal, because now you're just attacking the person because you don't have anything else to talk about. And that's what happens here. They're attacking Paul. They're bringing many and serious charges against him. So a lot of noise, a lot of volume, a lot of intensity, a lot of accusations. That's all a pile-on, which they could not prove. That's why there has to be this sudden cascade of accusations, this incredible intensity, this emotion and passion, because they don't have facts. Meanwhile, in verse 8, while Paul said in his own defense, I have committed no offense, the same thing he's been saying against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. The first two addresses the charges they're making about that he's teaching. This goes all the way back to that first confrontation, that he's teaching things against the law. Paul's not. In fact, he even joined one of the purification rituals in the temple. What Paul is teaching is what Jesus said. Flip over to Matthew chapter 6, chapter 5. In the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus speaks about the law, he says it this way in chapter 5, verse 17. He says, do not think that I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. So Paul is not speaking against the law, but rather he's simply saying the law is now fulfilled. The Messiah has come, and he has completed all things, or he has brought to fruition all that the law was promising and anticipating. In the second charge against the temple, that was the thing that got the crowd riled up. He's brought a Gentile into the temple and desecrated it. The lawyer tried to say he tried to. So to the first 2 points, the things the chief priests are making all this noise about, is as far as the law of the Jews or against the temple, I haven't done anything wrong. and where that argument centers, where they have that fuss, from Festus' standpoint as a Roman governor, he could be like, so? For example, if the big charge is, he ate a pork sausage and we all saw him do it, which is a violation of the law, and Festus is going to think, okay, well, so, seems like a silly law in the first place, but whatever. It has nothing to do with Roman law. Now, Paul gets, so in an atmosphere where people are loud and passionate and they're making all these accusations and this big pile-on that's going on, Paul has a very straightforward and firm demeanor. Now remember, Paul's had 2 years of thought and prayer and meditation and rest and preparation for what's happening here. So the third thing he says, which would have a jolt, it'd be a jarring jolt to Festus, so I have committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar. Paul stands before the judgment seat of Caesar. Paul stands under the crest of Rome. And so he's reminding Festus, you're a Roman governor, I'm a Roman citizen. Where have I done anything against Caesar? And there are no accusations. Luke doesn't give us the specifics of the accusation or the defense because we've already heard it before. There's no new information listed or given. So there is no charge that Paul has violated a Roman law, which begs the obvious question. Why are we here? Why are we in a Roman court? Why are we waiting on a Roman governor to dispense judgment and justice if there has been no violation of Roman law? Verse 9, the noise that these fellows made, one, their pomp and circumstance and giving Festus the tour of Jerusalem, Festus's early desire to connect with the Jews and exchange pleasantries and all that kind of stuff that the muckety-mucks do. And then with their fervor that they have attacked Paul and accused Paul, he's already trying to appease them. He's trying to, because they're the leaders. They're the powerful ones. Paul, whoever he is a nobody. So who cares about currying Paul's favor when obviously a good politician would be interested in making connections and exchanging favors with these prominent Jews. So, verse 9, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, which is what they asked for originally about having him come to Rome, so he's trying. He answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? Boy, how the Jews' ears must have perked up. Yes, 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 this is exactly their request, and he brings it back up. What they ask him in Jerusalem, he now asks Paul, which is interesting because he's heard all of this accusation. So where's his due diligence? Where's his duty as a Roman to bring about law and justice? Why on earth should a Roman governor take a Roman citizen in a Roman trial and move the jurisdiction of the trial to Jerusalem? They're standing there in the courtroom. Let's get this done. Well, in the 2 years that Paul has had to contemplate all of this, it seems obvious that he's not going to get anywhere at this rate, and he does have the promise from the Lord that he is to go to Rome. And what's interesting is what seems to fit is perhaps when Paul first heard, as you're my witness here, so you shall be in Rome, he probably didn't picture it that he would be in chains, but that he would travel and go and speak like he's been doing. But now enough time has passed, perhaps Paul has realized, well, the way this is going to happen is through this imprisonment, that I'm going to be an emissary of Christ in Rome in chains. So what Festus just did is revealed that he is not going to pursue justice. He's not going to do the right thing, that he's being swayed by the Jews in terms of politics and favors. This is not about truth. So, verse 10, now Festus has to ask Paul by Roman law. He cannot change the venue of the trial without the defendant's permission. That's why he asks. Verse 10, but Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you yourselves also very well know. Now, interestingly enough, what the Jewish leadership brought was zeal and passion and noise, and they asked for favors. Paul is not asking for any favor at all. He's not begging. He should be the one here who's outnumbered, outgunned. He's a nobody. They're a bunch of somebodies. And Paul just is clear, firm, calm, but firm. I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. So why would I go to Jerusalem? What do the Jews have to do with this? I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know, because nothing of what's been said has stuck. None of it's been true. None of it's been factual. None of it's had evidence provided. None of it's been proven. Verse 11, if then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. Where they are begging for a favor, Paul won't even beg for his life. He's so confident in his innocence. He says, look, if you find something I've done worthy of death, then by all means, let's get this show on the road. But as he continues, but if none of these things is true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand me over to them. Wow. Paul verbally and no doubt physically looks Festus right in the eye and says, no one can do this. That includes Festus. That specifically includes Festus. For all of his pomp and circumstance in his high chair, Festus just realizes he doesn't have the authority in the room. He didn't get to know Paul, and he's learning fast, and he's learning the hard way in public view. Paul is a force to be reckoned with because he is a servant of the Most High God, and he is not intimidated by anything less. Not at all. So, if I've committed anything worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if none of those things are true of which these men accuse me, no one can hand them over. No one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. That is, there was no doubt a pause and a steely look in Festus's eyes as Paul made eye contact with him. But it is a formal expression. The Roman citizen has the right to demand an appeal to Caesar. It's not quite like our legal system in the United States, where once a trial has concluded and a verdict has been rendered, that's when the defendant has an opportunity to make an appeal to a higher court. But you have to wait until the verdict is given and all of that. In Rome, if the Roman citizen felt like he was not going to be given justice, or if this was not a just process, he could appeal to Caesar. By doing so, it takes it out of that local venue and moves it, what we might even call more of a federalization. It's going to take the process right to the very courts in Rome. So to get out of whatever local issue, maybe there's some good old boy stuff going around or whatever, this was a Roman law that helped protect due process for a Roman citizen. Paul invokes it. He invokes this, just like he said to Lysias, are you going to, or to the centurion, are you going to scourge a Roman citizen? And that changed everything. When Paul drops that, everything changes. I appeal to Caesar. That is a formal statement and it is a legal process. Looks like Paul over the last couple of years has been thinking a lot about this and has been given guidance. It's time to move on. There's been enough conversation with those in Jerusalem. They have heard the truth now several times. They heard it from the steps of the barracks. They heard it within the chambers of their own council. And then they heard it before Felix. And now they've heard it again in front of Festus. That's enough. They are not going to hear. As Jesus taught his disciples, that they are to shake the dust off their sandals and go on. And that's what Paul here does. I appeal to Caesar. Verse 12, then when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar, and to Caesar you shall go. He would confer with his council, his legal counsel, probably because he's brand new. Probably he's just making sure. And the other problem with this, what's in play here, is Festus has more or less forced Paul's hand. They had the trial. He invited the accusers to come from Jerusalem. They did. They gathered around Paul and they made all the accusations, which none of them were proven. Paul points this out, and then Festus should have said, I find this man innocent. I find this man has done nothing worthy of death. I find that this man has done nothing worthy of imprisonment. You are set free. And there would have been a stern reminder to the Jews, he is a Roman citizen, you better leave him alone. That was what was really clear. And that's what Paul said to Festus, as you yourselves know, verse 10, as you also very well know, is how my translation reads. So Festus should have done the right thing, but he doesn't because he wants to please the Jews. Once he plays that card, or once that's revealed, once Paul sees that this is not about truth, this is not about justice, and they've had their time. There's other people that need to hear the gospel, other people that need to hear about Jesus, even though this is an unusual process to do it, but it allows Paul to have unusual audiences. So a second reason why Festus could be conferring with his advisors, one, he's brand new to the area, so he's likely gathering, making sure he's got all the right information. He does have to allow this appeal to move forward. But number two, he's in a bind. He's in trouble. Because when Paul says, I appeal to Caesar, once he gets into Caesar's court, what is it Paul is going to say, and what is he going to say about this brand new governor named Festus and how he's handled the case? And can you imagine the raised eyebrows when this case gets all the way to Rome and the same accusations are made that are unproven and it's a matter of Jewish stuff? Could you imagine Festus' superiors, if not Caesar himself, saying, you sent this man to us over what? You couldn't just tell the Jews to knock it off, that this was some kind of Jewish minutia nonsense and it had nothing to do with Rome? This is not hard to see. And so, in fact, that's the very thing that Festus will say. He will acquiesce to a request in the sense of he's going to curry some more favor with another local dignitary, but he will use an excuse which has a lot of truth. And that is, if you look toward the end of the chapter, we'll get to eventually this question about in verse 24, Verse 25, but I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him, yet I have nothing definite about him to write to my lord. I need some more information. What happens next in verse 13, after a few days have passed, because Festus is sort of stuck now. He's got to abide by the appeal request, but he doesn't have anything to send. Because the worst part is when Festus sends Paul to Rome, what will be the statement of charges? What is it that Festus is going to record that are the accusations against Paul that merits a trip to Rome? He didn't have anything. So he's met by another dignitary, since he's new in the region, in verse 13. Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. So we had the chief priests and the scribes coming from Jerusalem, and now you've got King Agrippa. Rome has given him authority over the temple, and so you might say Jewish culture. He's not in charge over the territory, Rome is. But he's over the temple, over the religious stuff, if you will, and we would call that kind of the Jewish culture. They're going to visit, and they're going to get interested in Paul's story, and now, before Paul leaves Caesarea, he will have an opportunity to share who he is in Christ with King Agrippa and Bernice. So Paul keeps having these amazing, unique opportunities as God is moving him toward Rome, and these folks are given opportunity to hear the truth. These influential leaders could, upon conversion, have led people to know God. They're going to refuse that, sadly, but they will be given the opportunity. Paul has spent 2 years not sulking, but praying. He spent 2 years not pouting, but preparing. And now with great calmness, with his old adversaries swirling around him that are so blinded by hate, they're falling all over themselves in this incredible darkness, planning to murder him in great wickedness, lying before Festus, and all of this while wearing the robes and the attire of the holy men of Israel. Where Paul very plainly states truth, and it brings conviction. As Festus said, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. But not before there's a conversation with King Agrippa and Bernice.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb